Eileen, welcome to Montreal. Welcome to the Phi Center. Yes. So you've heard the introduction. You've heard the conversation.
Yes, I could have jumped in. Yeah, points.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So what do you have to say about what's going on right now in the culture?
I both embrace it and distrust it.
Right.
You know, I was just thinking that I've lived through moments where suddenly we discovered incest. Suddenly we discovered rape. You know, that was the 80s and the 90s.
What do you mean discovering?
Well, it was just suddenly like somebody came forward and somebody else came forward, and there was a book, and there were revelations, and there were trials, and there were like absurd trials, and there were witch hunts, and you know, there were so many levels of discourse and questioning and, you know, chest bearing, and there were really good things, but then they kind of passed like blips.
Right.
And we're over incest now, and yeah, you were raped and so on.
I think that's the biggest problem. It's when these things came to light at all these different moments, it was never dealt with in a real way. It came to light, it was sort of addressed, then it was forgotten, swept under the rug, and it's this accumulation.
Well, what you said earlier about I want to burn it all down, the problem is that's kind of what needs to happen in a way. It's sort of like we are talking about something called patriarchy, which nobody wants to use that word because it's so cliched in 70s and PC and feminist and whatever. But the fact of the matter,
that's what it is.
Yeah, because it's like, I mean, Weinstein, for instance, I mean, the story I heard was that, in fact, he was at a lower point in his career. The reason you could throw this sacrificial lamb.
Right.
Also, can I say it? Fat Jew. You know, all the anti-Semitism, he's the appropriate abuser.
Right.
You know, as opposed to when we watched Casey Affleck, white male, heterosexual Oscar meat.
Yeah.
White Oscar meat. Are we going to take him down? Everybody knew that he had done something.
Right.
Didn't make a blip. Nobody would take it on. And you watch the cringe of the woman who received her Best Actress award from that disgusting guy.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. And we see that in so many industries, you know, where we know it and we're still allowing it to happen. You know, like Terry Richardson in the fashion world. And
all of those industries that are not as glamorous also.
Yeah.
It's a question of what your value is. Because again, I think Casey Affleck, I think Woody Allen, these are artists that we revere. Weinstein's a producer and at a low point.
Right.
So it's just, there's a little, you know, and then I think the thing you were saying about trauma and people denying that they went through trauma. I think trauma. So I mean, I've been traumatized. I've been sexually assaulted, and
so you've spoken a lot about your own sobriety. I'm sober. I've been 6 years sober. There are two kinds of sober people. There are people who were not ever that interested in drugs and alcohol. Tranna, I think you're one of those.
I've just never gone. I've never gone down that road. But I have a whole lineage.
You're just not drunk.
Yeah.
No, but I have a whole. It's in my. You know, I have a whole lineage of alcoholics.
Genetics?
On my father's side, who's not a part of my life. And I think also for me, like that not wanting to drink or do drugs was not wanting to be associated with my idea of him.
Right.
You know?
And there are people who were too interested in drugs and alcohol, and I was certainly one. I am certainly one of them.
No, I was a falling down drunk, and I love drugs of all kinds, and was really lucky that I came through that without several, you know.
But experiencing that moment right now as a sober addict, I feel there's a level of understanding that, you know, some people, if they're, you know, high out of their minds, or if they're in the problem and they haven't really sort of addressed the problem or the trauma, there's no way really that they can like see themselves as the predators.
Trauma can take you down. And I think every time we look at a suicide by a woman, by a queer person, I think there was trauma there.
Yeah.
And they didn't, like in that, remember the Nate Parker scandal, and then the woman who was, you know, gang raped when he was in college and so on. And her story was the dark story. It was just like, and she went on and she was depressed and she killed herself, and end of that story. And I think every woman, every queer, every person who's like kept going, you sort of take the trauma in and it drives you.
Yeah.
You're almost like your own kind of borderline. You know, it's sort of like, that's almost like success meat. You know, I'm going to show them. You know?
But how do you live with that after so many years? You've been sober 34 years.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that you've dealt with a lot of that.
I mean, it comes and it goes. I mean, I think I feel lucky that I have memory to access and to use when I mean, like, I think the trick of knowing when to say something and when not to say something is something I'm still negotiating and learning.
Right. I think that's one of the hardest parts about this moment that we're in is when do you say something? How do you say something? Because it's so easy to take something the wrong way.
Yeah.
And
you've used the word loudmouth yourself to
right.
describe
it's been used against me.
Against you, but I think you should own. Do you own it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it just when I see it in the hands of like journalists, where I said in the course of some interview, you might think I'm this. I mean, you might think I'm a genius, or you might think I'm a loudmouth lesbian. And then the article, the banner is loudmouth lesbian, and then it goes into a festival where that's in my bio. And I was like, wait a second, this is homophobia now.
Yeah.
How'd you get there?
Yeah.
So it's like the
how
thing
do you?
that's
Yeah, because language, as a writer, language is everywhere. It's limiting. It's freeing.
Yeah.
How do we deal with language right now?
I think we just we try and be skillful and awake. I mean, I keep meaning. I've gone through streaks where I've meditated a lot, and that's not been lately. A few days ago, I did a minute. I was like, a minute, just do a minute, and get going, because I need to be conscious, and it's so hard.
Right.
And if I'm not conscious, I say things, and I think, why did I say that? I mean, I'm pretty good, but I mess up, and then I feel like I wasn't awake.
Right. But that when you mentioned the way that you'll say in an interview, "I'm a loudmouth lesbian," that sort of becomes how you're labeled.
Sobriquet or sobriquet, they say.
Especially for you right now, having this moment where you're getting a lot of mainstream attention.
Right.
Do you feel sort of suffocated by having to explain who you are to people? Because I feel like you're someone who tends to shy away from labels. Your pronoun is they. So there's this sort of rejection of the binary and these sort of like limitations of
and even as a writer,
labels.
You would go from poetry to prose and fiction and sort of
which is sort of gender fluid or genre fluid.
Exactly.
Well, they, of course, I feel like they keeps becoming part of the discussion. And I was like, can't I simply say that's my pronoun like it was the beginning of a class rather than that being the conversation now? And I think part of it is it ageism that I'm not, and I knew that. I thought it's so fun because I've always felt like there just wasn't a they to use.
Right.
Yeah. And so now I pick it up and people are like, you're in your 60s, you're using they. I thought kids do that. And I was like, why do I have to? I'm allowed to continue to be radical and find new ways to express my being.
But do you feel like people are trying to put you in a box? Do you feel like now that you're profiled in the New York Times and getting all this attention that people just want to try to figure you out?
But people want to talk about that.
Right.
People want me to pick my scabs with them instead of becoming like a major writer or a queer pundit or let's talk about, I think we're talking about all of it, and that's great. But I think there's a weird way, like, even in my novels and stuff, I've always called novels, not memoirs. So then half of everything will be like, why is this a novel? It's a memoir. Ma thinks it's a novel. We're just like fighting the gender. And I think that's so much about female power. That I, as one who is perceived to be female, I really don't have the right to set the boundaries. And I think the most interesting thing coming up with all the sexual harassment is the micro moments, like in Claudia Rankine's The Microaggressions. Everybody who's female or queer has had the experience of being in a restaurant and some waiter comes and hip touches, kind of scoots around you. And lately there was some Brit who somebody went to jail. A Scottish guy went to jail in the Middle East for hip touching a man,
I saw
an
that.
Arab, as they said. And I realized everybody was so appalled. This is touchy. These overly sensitive Arabs. I was like, every woman's skin crawls when somebody idly hip touches me and has no right to touch my body.
Exactly.
And it's just like, that's nothing. That's nothing. We're going to rape, So it's sort of like a hip touch is a joke. How dare I have boundaries? How dare I think you don't have the right to touch me?
Well, I was going through, I know it sounds stalkerish, but I was reading just a couple of your most recent tweets, getting ready for today's conversation. And I saw you write about the hip touching, and it was like, I just never thought about it. But then as soon as I read that, you think of all the instances, and it's like, there's no respect for my boundaries. I feel like, as a trans person, there's always been, or even just as a queer kid who didn't know what they were yet, just the entitlement that people feel to enter your space and say what they want, and just it's so
I have the right
overwhelming.
to move you around.
Yeah.
I'm at work. I don't know what you're doing.
You're an object,
Yeah, you're just going to the bathroom or whatever the hell I'm doing. And likewise, I just the thing of, I don't know how to negotiate, and you walk into a restaurant, you walk into a hotel, you open a door, they say ma'am, they say miss.
Yeah.
And it's just like, the older I get, the angrier I get. It's like, how dare you decide what my genitals are? I feel like it makes me, ladies, ladies ready now? You finished eating? It's sort of, and it's so weird, of course, because we'll be a number of things sitting at the table. Some like ladies, some don't like ladies.
Have you always felt that way, or you feel empowered by the younger generation sort of?
I think I've always felt that way to some extent, but it seems like it's sort of like rising. My gorge is rising. Yeah. It's just like, because it seems wronger, and I think my power rising. Yeah. And I've always followed. I think it was Maya Angelou who would be like talking about some guy who was driving her and say, "Hey Maya, really?" And she was like, "Excuse me, my name is Miss or Ma'am Angelou. How dare you?" And I thought, that's cool, but that's so tough,
right?
But I feel like that now, and I don't know whether I would feel that way whether I had this nice growing career or not.
Right.
But just like my embodiment feels at this point,
in a way,
your gender to me.
Your power is protecting you right now. In a way.
Yeah,
in a way. So you came to New York in the late 70s. Mid 70s, yeah. And
it's good to get it right.
And you...
I didn't miss disco, early disco. I'm sorry it happened. Yeah.
And were you a disco fan?
Yeah.
Yes and no. There was a punk disco line. You sort of weren't supposed to like disco, but it was really fun.
Right, exactly.
And
I love it, so that's why I had to ask.
And you
Sylvester.
You hung out with so many of the queer luminaries from the 70s, like poets, writers, Ginsberg, John Ashbery, of course, and Mapplethorpe. Like, how do you feel being sort of that bridge for our generation that never knew these people? Like firsthand, like we know of them, reading about them, reading their work, but they're not around anymore. Like, how do you feel being that, you were that kid around them,
right? And
now you're here, and you sort of you're like this transmission.
Well, it's very funny because it's sort of like you start to wind up being like the last man standing.
Right.
I was like, suddenly I'm a beat, and I was like, because there aren't any. They're all dead beats, and then and there's a live beat, so you get to be. I mean, so that's sort of funny. I guess I regard it as sort of humorous, and I try and brush it off a little bit, and then I claim. I mean, it was the point too is the scale was so different. It was a small world. To come to New York in the 70s was to just walk into like St. Mark's Church. It was this institution. It happened to be the alternative church of the weird and queer poetic. Nobody called it queer.
Right.
It just happened to be that.
Right.
And the room was open, and I remember being young and standing at a party with like Allen Ginsberg and Robert Lowell, and I'm like, I just moved here from Boston. This is crazy that this is so easy.
Right. So it really was that easy? It was just that open?
Because there weren't that many there were people who would obviously write letters to those people, and they would go, but there still weren't that many people who were just in the room with them.
Right.
And we were regarded as family. Like, I remember being at some benefit reading, and I read my hot new poem about, I just came out, and the girl I was in love with didn't want me, and I read this long, like tortured poem. Allen Ginsberg comes running up and says, "Who are you?" And I was like, I'm me.
Did you have that writer's drive, to achieve all that you have achieved, or at the time?
It's all, it's a default position. I just figure when I figured out about poetry, it was just like I was already such a. Do we use 4-letter words? What's the deal here?
Yes, of course.
I was such a fuck up on so many levels. I mean, I only was good at art and being funny and writing poems. And I was a bad employee. I got fired from every job there was. And at work, I was always writing a poem. So at some point in my earlier 20s, I figured out that what I actually was doing was writing poems, not being a good, enterer of data into early computers and stuff. And so it just got to, it kept being like, this is the end of the road. You either go forward. When I got to New York, because I tried to move. It was
the only option, really.
Yeah, I tried to move. I hitchhiked in Europe after college, because that's what we did in 1971. And then I tried to move to San Francisco. I wasn't out yet. I was freaked out. I started having a nervous breakdown. Went back to Boston. I kept running away, running back. And then finally, the last time I went back, I realized I couldn't go home again. I didn't fit.
Yeah.
They didn't know who I was. There were no more going away parties for me. And then the last move was to go to New York. And once I got there, I thought, nobody can stop me. I'm all alone. Nobody knows what I'm doing. Nobody's watching me. I can do anything I want.
And that's a few years before you got sober, so you must...
Oh, yeah, that was like, 8 years before, so I had some ways to go.
Right.
I had some trauma to produce.
And did you have an idea of what you wanted your life and work to look like at that point? Or were you just in the moment taking things as they came?
Well, I was borrowing ideas from famous lives. You know, there was Gertrude Stein, there was Oscar Wilde, there was Hart Crane. I mean, there were just all these stories of artists coming to New York or artists being in their cities and performing themselves. And so I got that, the artist as you know, like kind of like your life was art.
Right. Yeah.
I got that, and that was very big in the 70s and 80s, you know.
Yeah.
So there's a lot about, you know, making myself up in the model of, you know.
One thing that I find is great is you don't strike me as someone who's nostalgic. You know,
it's like kind of like, because it's like traveling heavy versus traveling light. You know, there's always these like, we're gonna have a reunion and we're gonna have a Howl festival, and I mean, like it seems good, but there's something inherently depressing about who we were. I just feel like in some weird way I'm coming into my own more now than ever, meaning that people are letting me be who I am. It's not that they were stopping me; they just weren't paying me for it.
Right.
You know, when I was younger.
So. Yeah, how did you support yourself as a poet for all these years? It's a really naive question, but
I mean,
especially in those early days.
Yeah.
Well, crap jobs, and it was cheaper.
Yeah,
and the kindness of strangers and friends, and tons of enablers. I mean, it's just like, you know, there are rooms where people say, "Remember the price of your last drink," and I always got my drinks for free. Like, I went where the drinks were.
Right.
You know?
A lot of people are saying that New York has changed a lot, but you sound like someone who's you don't sort of think about that much.
Well, I fight for it still. We're horrified in the same way we have this one conversation about politics, and we're like, okay, every conversation is a singularity that goes there, and we were like, holy shit, look where we are, you know? And so every moment in New York eventually goes to, did you see that? You know, and something great is gone and something horrible has been erected. But the thing is, it's still the people thing that I find. They're just nights.
New Yorkers are still New Yorkers, though.
Yeah,
and all of this.
Tables that accumulate at, you know, like there's still nights of like 3 events and you wind up someplace and there's a conversation, and I just can't believe who happens to be in town tonight.
Right.
And it's like people who live there, people who don't live there. There's just it's a meeting place, it's a hub, and I still regard it as home.
Yeah.
How did you pick Marfa? Because you have a second home in Texas, Western Texas.
Well, it was a myth to me. It was just like I write art, I do art writing, and I have lots of friends who are visual artists, and so I always heard of this Marfa place. And even in my tours, I was like, I want to read in Marfa, and people would give me an email, and that person would never answer me. I was like, how come I can't? And there was a residency. The Lannan Foundation has these. I mean, there's art ones, Chinati Foundation, Marfa, you know, the Judd Foundation, but there's a literary one, and I got invited at last. You know, it's sort of like, for me, 50 to 60 is when I got invited.
Right.
Suddenly everybody's inviting me. So I got invited. I went for a month in this amazing posh residency, and as soon as I got there, I was like, this is the place. And I had been a college professor for 5 years in San Diego. It was like one of the sadder experiences of my life, but did many good things for me. And I love teaching. It was great in many ways.
Right.
But at that time, they had money and they would buy you a house. And I just got, you know, it was like I bought a cheap.
They would buy you a house in San Diego? Or?
To get you to come.
Okay,
right.
And I was like, I still was like a working class American who wanted to own a house. So I was like, okay. But so I bought a house cheap. The market exploded. It was valuable.
Amazing.
By the time I had gone through the breakup and my dog died, the house was underwater and worth nothing. And then I was stuck being a landlord for 7 years. So but I'd finally, by the time I got to Marfa, I had enough money to
How do you
buy a
navigate
cheap house.
all of these worlds, like the literary world on one hand, and then like TV and like well,
TV is a recent twist. It's pretty funny.
So how do you see yourself like just like in those spaces, being like, this is my life now?
Do you not believe at some level that life is a dream?
I believe it. and you know how they say that you can't die in your own dream? You can't experience your own death.
You've done it a few times.
So, but I feel like, that's what, I mean, who am I to say? I have no idea. But I have this idea or imagining that the minute we get to as close to death as possible, but then just wake up into the next dream.
Right.
You know, like these levels of dreams. Because have you had dreams within dreams? You wake up and you think you're actually awake, and then all this other weird stuff starts happening. You realize, oh, I'm still sleeping.
Right.
You know?
But I think there are miraculous moments in your life, whether it's you met somebody or you're like, okay, this is too ridiculous that this is happening. I can't believe that I can have this, or that I'm meeting this person, or that you love me. You know, and I was like, am I awake? Am I sleeping?
Yes.
And it's just this kind of weird, and so coincidence. And so I think that it's weird. When I was growing up, there was a great TV show called Dobie Gillis, The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis. And it was like Bud Schulberg. I can tell you who wrote it. It was basically a Jewish comedian show. And Dobie would sit there with the crew cut with his hand on a chin and say, let me tell you about Thalia Minninger. And he would talk about his girls. Chelsea Girls is totally Dobie Gillis.
Yeah,
it's sort of like, it's the Woody Allen type guy that is just like, I'm obsessed with this girl, and stuff. And so and his best friend on the show was this guy named Maynard G. Krebs, who was Bob Denver, who was a beatnik. And he was always like, you rang? And he was in a dirty sweatshirt. And all of us who came up in the 50s and 60s, like, to be queer at Halloween was to be a beatnik.
Right.
And girls would wear berets and boys would wear sweatshirts. And that's when I could do drag. Yeah. And I'd wear a sweatshirt and jeans and I'd have a poem in my back pocket. So it was almost like my cartoon of the future was embedded in television.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I think, TV, mass audiences. And I remember even hearing Allen Ginsberg talk about how funny it was to see beatniks, kind of cartoonized on TV. So that when I wound up being a poet on Transparent, I thought this is so perfect.
Yeah.
Like because I've said literally in books of mine, I guess I'm a television poet.
Right.
Because my generation is so inspired by the golden age of television, 60s TV, where everybody watched the same show.
And I love Transparent, and I didn't know that character was based on you, but that character is so intense.
Yeah.
And do you feel like that character, that's really minimizing that character. The character is so complex and overwhelming, and I've never seen a character like that.
That's so great.
On television before.
Yeah. And of course Sherry Jones is fantastic.
Incredible.
And we're pals, and we have, when I met her at Jill's house the first time, they had just cut her hair like mine. And I don't know if you know Prince and the Pauper. It's like, it's sort of like we had a Prince and the Pauper moment where we were like, it was so funny. Yeah.
But did you feel like, I'm assuming that you watched those episodes?
Oh, sure.
With Sherry Jones.
Early on, Jill showed them to me to see, like, just let me.
Right.
And I was nervous, but it was like the relief was that it wasn't me, honestly.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I was getting
Absolutely.
at. Yeah,
it was like a bad copy.
Right.
Such a bad copy that I was in there so faintly, and it was more funny. And the funnier thing was that I was in the show being her friend.
Right. I know. It's so weird to see that now, knowing that backstory.
As a writer, there's just so many versions of you. There's the version you read in the books, and then there's the version we meet in person now, the version we read about in articles that we see on Transparent, that we, how do you, because you've talked about that, like how like media just creates these like different versions of people, but like ultimately, who is the real Eileen?
Right. And that's the dream. And it's also the struggle, the kind of Buddhist struggle to be present, and to kind of like not get too caught up in that being me or that not being me. And also it's just like it didn't happen when I was in my 20s. It happened in my 50s and 60s, and so it's sort of like I'm a little bit more, I'm sort of already ruined, already a wreck, already, this person. Just talking about Transparent though, I just want to celebrate them for a second, because I think the coolest thing that they have done is this season now where they talk about Palestine and Israel.
Yes.
Nothing in Hollywood would touch that. And it's not getting a lot of press.
No, and I'm surprised that it's not.
Well, we know why it's not. That censorship.
Yeah.
If we don't talk about it, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But I love that
Me too.
Jill and the show has the courage to...
I haven't finished watching this season yet, but I'm loving it. And we were talking about, moments that feel like a dream. Was Jill Soloway coming into your life one of those sort of dream moments?
Well, it was really, it's really funny. There's somebody in San Francisco, there's a Jewish museum, and that's where I met Jill, because it was like they in the writer's room had this lesbian college professor character, and my friend, the poet Allie Liebegot, who I had taught with in San Diego and did Sister Spit with and everything, is one of the writers. And so I think she was the one probably who said, this sounds like Eileen.
Right.
But the thing that was weird was that somebody named Gravity, who was a curator, I've got to connect with this person, at the Jewish Museum, was putting together a show. There was like a show called Read by Famous, and what it was really cool, like giving books to the homeless and various institutions. And the way they were fundraising was they went to Jill, who's Jewish, and said, what's a book that's really influenced by you? And she said it was Michelle T's Valencia. And they said, can we have your copy your dirty, smelly copy as an auction or to put in the And she said yes, and then they went to Michelle and said, "What is your book?" And she said, "Chelsea Girls." And so then they got her copy of Chelsea Girls, and of course they go to me and they said, "What's that book?" And I was like, "Masochism by Deleuze," which is like covered with crap and and stuff. And so then they decided to have a panel of these three women, and that's how me and Jill met. So the thing that's so funny is
it was very public from the beginning.
Yeah, we kind of had crushed out on stage. But what I didn't know is that she was kind of she had already been cyber stalking me and doing research and had already decided to be in a crush thing with this person.
Do you like that? Do you like being stalked?
No, but somehow in that occasion, since Jill is very skillful, she's not.
Being a writer, writers are good stalkers.
She knew how to not let me know until we were already in a relationship. But I'd love to. I mean, the thing I'm obsessed with now is Gravity. Gravity is the matchmaker, and it's sort of like, and Jill and I are great.
You have to meet them,
we're not. Jill and I are great friends now, and we're collaborators, and I think Amazon is going to do a movie of Chelsea Girls now, and I wrote the screenplay.
Exciting.
Yeah, I've written it, and sort of we're in process now. So it's just like it's sort of I'm the writer. They optioned it, so it's still how movies cannot happen, and so there's that. But I feel like it's going to happen, and that's pretty exciting.
So you're in Montreal right now to promote? Do we say like?
Yeah.
To share.
To read from my new book,
Afterglow, a memoir about Rosie, your dog, who died in 2006.
A pit bull. The profile dog.
But really, I feel it's a book about creativity and voice and that relationship between two souls.
And loss and dream and change and trauma, everything we're talking about.
So talking about that project, because you've been talking about that project, but when you were writing it, you were like sort of teasing at it, and then like after it came out, like how do people react, and even readers right now?
Well, it's a mix. Mostly, I mean, like review-wise, it's great. And the thing that's so funny is that finally, it's my Alice B. Toklas moment. Finally, I'm writing about something that's not Eileen Myles. So people are not reviewing me in the reviews. They're talking about the book.
That's great.
Which is incredible. I was like, Rosie, thank you. So that's probably the coolest part. And then it was actually a hard book to sell because I had so much success with Chelsea Girls and my Selected that people wanted more of this kind of crazy lesbian, drunken. And I was just like, my next book is a dog book. And I thought that was just sexism and ageism, that I'm not allowed to be a writer who has a next project. And so Grove was the cool press that picked it up, and people are liking it. But there are definitely rooms full of dog people are sitting there, and if I read the wrong part, they're like, "Where's the dog?"
Right.
And I asked that question in the book because the dog goes away.
It's
for a
whole
while.
new audience now. Like dog owners are gonna read Eileen Myles,
the dogista.
It's not your first time in Montreal. I want to end on this.
No, and I love Montreal. I've been coming here since I was young.
You were here the first time you were 19, you said, before we...
I was in college, and my one of my friends decided, we thought we wanted to get out of America. And we were like, Montreal. And so we went in the winter in January. It was colder than I had ever felt cold in my life. We stayed.
It was just after the Expo, right? Expo 67. Which is probably how you've heard of the city.
But also I'm from Boston. I grew up in Boston, so it's just like I had family that would go to some religious oratory in St. Joseph or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's just like Catholics go to
the Catholic connection.
And so we went, and we just had a horrendous. I mean, like we just that little girl trip. Like I went to New York like that too. You just go to the wrong part of the city. You wander around. You don't have enough money. You spend it stupidly. Weird guys hit on you and stuff. And then finally we were so broke and we wanted to spend more money. We cashed in our tickets and decided to hitchhike home. The first guy that picked us up took us into alleys and said obscene things and started jerking off and screaming, and we ran. And then some nice man picked us up who worried about whether our hands were cold and whether we had gloves, and we got home. And it was just like crazy.
That is crazy.
We hope you have a better experience this time.
already. And this is amazing.
Thank you so much, Eileen.
Thank you so
honestly,
much.
we feel so lucky to have met
a good
you
week
and
in Montreal.
Talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.